Put that on pause because I know that we are ready to get going. We've got quite a few people on the webinar, and I just want to welcome you all this morning. My name is Her. I'm one of the trainers from Echoes and Reflections, coming from Chicago. I'm a Chicago native, and pleased to be with you today to talk about a very sobering topic, which is contemporary anti-Semitism. And as this hour goes along, just want to encourage you, by the way, to introduce yourself on the chat box and, say who you are, where you're coming from, so that we just get a better sense of who you all are. And a little later on, we'll be doing a few polls on that point. But let me say really quickly about who Echoes and Reflections are all about. Many of you perhaps are already familiar with Echoes, but just to clarify that Echoes and Reflections has been around for about 13 years now, working with 50,000 educators and counting, providing them with the tools to help them teach the Holocaust to their students responsibly and effectively and in humanizing ways. And we do so with a variety of primary resources. And at the core of all the different resources we have, it is our 11 units focused on the Holocaust as well as contemporary anti-Semitism. And so that is what we're going to be focusing on today. Let me go ahead and show you what we'll be touching on for the next hour or so. So first, we'll be talking about what is contemporary anti-Semitism. Looks very different in some respects to what we have seen historically. And I'll explore that notion some more later. Also want to highlight those resources to help students understand contemporary anti-Semitism and to recognize it. We also, through this, is hoping that you begin to build the confidence and capacity, not only to teach this complex subject, but for you also to recognize contemporary anti-Semitism, how it's showing up today. And again, it is a very unique profile compared to what we have seen and understood of it historically. Before I plunge into those points, however, I want to make sure people are somewhat familiar with the Zoom platform. I am a unitasker. I cannot do a lot of different things that these wonderful platforms offer. So for my purposes, I'm going to rely on the chat box. And in that chat box, if you haven't opened it already, I'd like for you to make sure that you highlight all panelists and attendees in that drop box. So not only myself, but also the other folks who are attending will be able to read your piece. An important thing with all things technical is that you run into technical difficulties. Do not worry. We've got Sam, who is helping me with the tech on this, and you can find her by clicking on that blue drop down, and you'll see Echoes and Reflections. There's an actual real person there who can help you, and there she is. And she'll pop up every once in a while as we go on through this webinar. Okay, so let's get a sense of who is in this virtual room here. So we've just got 3 basic polls, and I'll have Sam go ahead and pull up the first poll. And as she does that, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the video so we can get this streaming happen more effectively. So school has begun, or has begun for the last couple of weeks, maybe for those just recently. Everyone's getting back into the groove. So in terms of the moment right now, how would you rank your energy level? 1 being I need an energy drink, to 5, bring it on. So what are some of those thoughts there? I thought we'd start on a kind of a light start there. So once people begin to vote, Sam can pull up the results and see what we've got. Okay, so how are we feeling, folks? Let's see the results. Okay, so you all have energy, and that is awesome. So some of you are in the middle of it all, but and then turning over towards bring it on. That is great energy, and I hope you can sustain that, because that is super. So thank you for that. Okay, we're moving on to the second poll, a little more of a serious tone here that speaks to our topic. So in the past 2 years, you've received reports, or for some of those you've heard reports about students who have said or have reported hearing someone say that the Holocaust didn't happen or was greatly exaggerated? Yes or no, in the past 2 years, to the best of your knowledge? Okay, once everybody's voted, Sam will be able to pull up the results. Okay, so interesting. So 2/3 of you have heard something to this effect. A third of you have not, or have not yet, depending on how we're feeling about this topic. So that's a really good thing for us to know, for me to know. Thank you for that. We're going to end with a third and final poll on the similar vein. So this is similar. In the past few years, I've received or heard of reports about students who believe or have reported hearing someone talk about the delegitimization of the state of Israel. So once everybody is able to reflect and think about that and respond. Okay, and the results, interesting. Okay, so a small majority said no, they have not heard that, but some of you have begun to hear those points being brought to the fore. So again, important things for us to recognize and know. So thank you very much, and thank you, Sam, for helping us with that pulse check. And I think that provides us with a good context as I move into highlighting the things that we've noticed with regard to anti-Semitism. Let me though first start with this quote from Elie Wiesel. I think we are very familiar with this individual, Holocaust survivor, author of Night and many other books, and the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And here he has this quote that's quite sobering. Once I thought that anti-Semitism has ended, today it's clear to me that it probably will never end. And the unfortunate truth is that the word persistence is something that I think really characterizes anti-Semitism. And let me highlight some of those examples of how it is showing up today. So as you know, last year in August, we had the Unite to Right March in Charlottesville, Virginia. They heard people reported hearing things like, "You will not replace us," or Jews, and that turned into Jews will not replace us. You heard a lot of Sieg Heil. You heard a lot of the phrase blood and soil, which is the Nazi slogan, Blut und Boden, and even phrases like Jews are Satan's children. Now this was very much a part of the news, deservedly, really high up there. But we also know that that's not the only thing that showed up as it speaks to events of contemporary anti-Semitism. This is a message at a temple in Seattle of last year, March 2017. By the way, these are all 2017 images. For those who have visited downtown Boston, you may recognize this Holocaust memorial. It's a beautiful memorial outside in a very public space. And here it was vandalized not only once, but twice. And this happened in August. Here is some graffiti written on a famous landmark near a very famous synagogue in Madison, Wisconsin, recognized as a more progressive town, city, and yet they're experiencing these things as well. And then lastly, in New York City, there are a variety of businesses, everything from bakeries, law offices, even Starbucks. They received this flyer. And certainly anti-Semitism wasn't the only thing that was expressed in this flyer. Again, this was all 2017. Let me pull the lens back even further, because one of the three partners of Echoes and Reflections, the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, is a civil rights organization. One of the many things that it does is monitors anti-Semitism. And they put out an annual report of all these anti-Semitic incidents that have been reported for decades. So the information I'm going to present to you next is found in their most recent report, 2017. It's found on their website, and you can see, thank you, Sam, that she pulled up the link for you for those who are curious to bookmark that to look at later. But let me give you some of those highlights for you. So take a look at this chart here. So we've got 2016 numbers, that which amounted to 1,267 incidents. And then you've got 2017 numbers, close to 2,000. That's a 57% increase. We see here that in 2017, every state had a reported incident, which hasn't happened in a very long time. Now, I want to emphasize the word reported, because there are incidents happening all the time, but the question is, are people, one, recognizing it, and then two, when they recognize it, do they have the willingness and ability, wherewithal to report it to an ADL office? So we would surmise, and I was in Montana and I was sharing some of these numbers, and they said, oh, no, that's a very small number. We know it's much larger. And this is people who were not Jewish, not from the community, in the Jewish community, but certainly was recognizing anti-Semitism showing up in the general public. So we know that these numbers are probably underreported for that reason. Here's another slide here. As you can see, 2017 experienced the highest level of reported incidents, more than 2.5 times that of 2013, which is the lowest reported here. Now, what's really sobering here is that the many images that we just saw in a previous slide were in these very public places or a religious institution. But the most sobering thing about the data of 2017 is that it's the elementary, middle, and high schools that have exceeded the number of incidents among all public places. Okay, so in other words, there were 257 incidences reported in schools, whereas there were 457, reported incidences at schools last year. 455 incidents reported in other public spaces. Okay, so you can see how schools was a space where they saw a lot of this happening. Okay, so here's a chart here that can show the comparison from 2016 to 2017. Okay, what's not in this chart, but you should also note, is that between 2015 to 2016, there was this huge increase, 106%. Okay, again, this is not on the chart, but just for you to know that this number is going up and up in really great ways. Now let me give you some examples of how it's showing up in the classroom setting, or in the school setting, excuse me. So here's a note that was slipped into a student's backpack. She identified as being Jewish. And this is, solid, liquid, and then you see gas. She has no idea who slipped that in there, but there you go. Here's another example. Snapchat, I think we all know it. We either love it or hate it or something in between. And Snapchat is certainly a medium for communication. And this was one way that a group of students thought to do so. You can see there's a kind of a globe here, a snow globe here, and then here's a cupcake here. Is that allowed? And you can see these expressions of anti-Semitism. Another one was found here. I don't know where the note came from, the first image. The second image came from Georgia. And this third image here was found on a high school desk in Rhode Island. So we recognize the swastika, we recognize the phrase white power. 14/88, I don't know if people are familiar with that, but this is a term, this is a phrase, an image, symbol recognized by white supremacists. 14 represents the 14 words written by a white supremacist. I won't bother to tell you what those are, it's really not important, but it's so recognized that 14 becomes symbolic of that. The 88 is representing the 8th letter in the alphabet, which is H, which represents the phrase Heil Hitler. So we are seeing the symbols coming up to convey anti-Semitism. Not pictured here, by the way, is, but I'll share with you anyways, it's an example of an incident from parents who called and said that their young son in elementary school was being harassed by the other kids. The other kids were saying things like Heil Hitler in his face, and were saying that he's going to get burned in the ovens. So there is some real lived experiences that people are facing. We don't know the intentions of children and young people doing and saying these things. You know, we can say that children, you know, they're children, they find subversive things like this funny. They don't understand, though. What's most important here is that they don't understand the impact of this. You know, it breeds fear in Jewish children as well as other children. You know, this signals a shift in the school climate and really can potentially affect and shift the culture of the school, what is allowed and what's not allowed. Now, we know that discipline is a tool that can be used in these situations, but so too is education. You know, recognizing that Holocaust education can help us understand human impact, right? To show us that these situations are not funny. We also can use education. We can also talk about anti-Semitism in a general education, anti-bias education context, you know, and try to really include anti-Semitism as part of those conversations. I think that's a really critical thing for us to think about. So how can we do this? Let me take you now to the website, Echoes and Reflections. And for those who are not familiar with the website, here it is, echoesandreflections.org. This is our homepage. What I'm going to do for my purposes, though, is go to this thing called Teach. That's where you have the 11 core lessons, units rather. And if you click on lesson plans there, you'll see there are 10 units. Hopefully some of you have played with some of these units and used these units. I think they're fantastic because they really try to make real, if you will, this topic, done so safely in and safely out. These first 10 are focused on the times, the Holocaust era. But there's this 11th one, contemporary anti-Semitism. That's where I'm going to spend my time on here. Okay. We feel very strongly that that explicitly addressing anti-Semitism dispels the myth, dispels the idea that with the end of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism also ended. And we know that that is not the case. So we are going to provide you with these 3 lessons inside the unit. The first one is Introduction to Contemporary Anti-Semitism. What is it, basically? We have a second unit called Examples of Anti-Semitism Today. How does it show up? What does it look like? And then very importantly, because it's one thing to know this stuff, but then to do some action around it. Like, anti-Semitism is not inevitable. There are ways to interrupt it. Especially escalating into things that can really shift the culture, the school culture. And this is our section called Take a Stand. So what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the webinar is highlighting some of those resources that you can find. Not all of them, obviously, but some of them, just to give you a starting point. Let's see. Let's go actually back to my PowerPoint here. Okay, so what I'd like to do is actually start with a visual testimony. This is one of our primary resources that I find that a lot of educators and students love. It really helps make it real, if you will, again. And so what I'm going to do as a way to introduce this is to play for you a testimony by Marta Wise. And as you listen to her testimony, what word or phrase jumps out for you? You know, there's no right or wrong answer here. What phrase or word jumps out for you? And as you're listening to it, whether it's during or afterwards, please type that in the chat box. Again, don't forget to have all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see that, see your comments there. And you can find her clip. So we're in the first lesson here, and you can find her clip right here. You just click on that. For those who are unfamiliar with it, you just click on that. It pops up. Here's a little bit about who she is, and in brevity, Marta Wise was born October 8th, 1934 in Czechoslovakia. She was in the Sarvar ghettos and then later in the Sered concentration camp, as well as in Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp. When the war began, Marta was 5 years old. So I always love that last sentence because it provides us context about how she understood her experiences through what kind of lens. And that also, I think, for many of our students, begins to make those connections as well. So let me just play that for you. And again, words or phrases that pop up, go ahead and put that in the chat box.
I think it's important that youth hear something from a survivor. And let's face it, I'm one of the youngest survivors. From Auschwitz, definitely. I don't think there's many my age. And I think it's important that I hear it from yourself. There was an interesting case I had in Camberwell High some years ago. And I must mention that. I spoke to children. I used to speak there for over 10 years every year, to the year 10s. And it's a very large school. I don't know if you know the school, and they're multicultural, very multicultural. And the first time I spoke for 45 minutes, and it wasn't enough. So after that, the woman in charge organized always to have a double period and brought all the kids into the library. And usually they are as quiet as you can hear a pin drop. And one particular occasion, there was a fight outside after I spoke. And usually she gives me 2 periods, because I said to her, it doesn't matter, you can't put it all into a very short period of time. And these are year 10 children, we've got to remember. So they're not that sophisticated, but that's when they do German history or something. And they usually ask questions and are very interested. And there was this fight outside as we were walking out, and she found out later, she called me and she found out later, was a boy, the son of a journalist, who had a fight with the other kids because he said she's lying, and all she said was lies, and it didn't happen like that. And there were no death camps, there were only concentration camps where people worked, and she's a liar. And so he had a fist fight with some other kids who says, how can you say it? You saw her number on her arm. And so this woman who organizes the talks called them in, and he said, listen, your father's a journalist, go home. My father said it's a lie, that's why he said. It's a lie and it's not true. So she said, I'll tell you what, go home, tell your dad that you heard this lady talk who said she was in concentration camp in Auschwitz, and you saw her number. She's talking about what happened to her. Ask him if he thinks if it's true or not, or whether it's a lie, that she's lying. And then come back and see me. So he came back. We're talking about, 15, 16-year-olds. And he came back with his tail between his legs, and he said, yes, I had a talk with Dad, and I told him that I actually heard this lady talk. I saw her number on her arm. And he admitted that he's an anti-Semite, and that's why he's always been writing and saying that it didn't happen. So she rang me up to tell me, because she knows how much it takes out of me, and she just felt that it makes it a bit worth, the pain more worthwhile.
Thank you, Marta. So folks, if you could, just quickly, a word or a phrase that jumped out for you, if you could put that in the chat box. Okay, we've got some comments: multicultural, quiet and interested, not sophisticated children, lies, anti-Semite. Thank you for that, Mary. Cecilia writes, anti-Semite as journalist, writing Holocaust didn't happen. Sam writes, admitted he was an anti-Semite. Sorry, the chat box got cut off here, so I can't see your full names. My apologies here. Sammy admitted he was an anti-Semite. Daddy said, Melinda said. So yeah, that's good. We're beginning to just get a sense of what she's saying. And that's a lot of what we'd like our young people, our students to do, is just to get a sense of what is being said, what jumps out for them. And it becomes a great conversation about why, what's the significance of it for them. Let me play you another clip, similar question as well. We're gonna listen to Felix. Felix's face didn't show up here. Oh, sorry. We're going to do the same thing, though. What word or phrase jumps out for you when you listen to Felix's? A bit about him. He was born April 2nd, 1917 in San Antonio, Texas, was part of the U.S. Armed Forces, liberated Buchenwald and Dachau. And when the war began, he was 22 years old. So let's take a listen to what he has to say.
A few years ago, about 2 years ago, I was speaking in San Diego as a guest of the Marine base at Camp Pendleton, California. And one of the people in the audience, as the public was invited, one of the people in the audience came up to me and showed me a leaflet. I have copies of it here, which anyway is put out by an outfit called the Historical Institute of Costa Mesa, California. And they put out a pamphlet which has a bunch of questions and answers, which in effect states that the Holocaust never happened. In that literature, it says that no Jews were killed in concentration camps. That was all made up. And that the crematoriums and the concentration camps that still exist over there were constructed after the war as tourist attractions. Well, you have to be sick, very sick, to come out and preach today that the Holocaust never happened. And these are people with great hatreds. Obviously, they're neo-Nazi type, they're Hitler worshippers. So I have done my best to try to dispel the idea that it never happened. And not only me, but there were thousands of American soldiers, British soldiers, Russian soldiers. Dachau was one of hundreds of concentration camps that the Germans maintained. So there were thousands of British, American, and Russian soldiers who liberated those camps who saw firsthand. And thousands of pictures were taken. To say that it never happened is the height of stupidity and viciousness. So I'll fight those type of people to my last breath.
So that's Felix's. So again, back to the kind of reflection on his story. What word or phrase jumped out for you? Mary writes sick, very sick. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mary. Monique writes height of stupidity and viciousness. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Cecilia writes, idea camps constructed after the fact for tourism. Thank you for that. Lynn writes, gas chambers were a tourist attraction. Yes. So again, just really helpful to gauge our students and what is it they're really focused on. Now let's put these two together. And just again, for the purposes of time, I just want to focus on this second question, okay? What are some reasons why Marta and Felix believe it is important to speak about, their experience during the Holocaust? Some thoughts on that. What do you hope your students will be able to consider with this question? What are some reasons why it's important to speak out, to speak about their experience during the Holocaust? Cecilia writes, to speak the truth. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other thoughts, other things that you hope your students will consider as they're listening to these two testimonies and that question. Mary writes, honor the memory of the dead. Thank you for that. Other thoughts on that point, other ways of understanding this. Monique writes, understand the importance of testimony and a first-hand witness. Thank you for that. And Lynn writes, it is history. Thank you for that. Yes, I think all of those points, I think what's essential in what I think what folks are texting or what people are chatting here is the fact that you know, there is this history. How can you deny that existed? And yet, for both of them, they are facing people who are denying or otherwise distorting the genocidal of the Holocaust. It also speaks to the persistence of anti-Semitism by mere fact these questions are coming up, questioning the Holocaust. You can't help but wonder, like, what is the motivation for doing such things when the facts are so clear? I think it's also really powerful that they shared, and to be honest, I don't know where they are in terms of their life. I hope they're still alive and still speaking out, but we know that survivors and liberators are, for obvious reasons, may no longer be able to share their stories. And so these video testimonies can be very helpful in continuing that message. We now have the responsibility to combat the ignorance and the hate. We have now the responsibility to, if you will, bear witness. You also heard from their testimony the kind of anti-Semitism that we're talking about when we refer to contemporary anti-Semitism, and to, oops, it's down here, excuse me. There it is. In the second lesson here, types of anti-Semitism, we have this handout that just helps us understand how anti-Semitism has morphed into this new form. So we have here first, still persisting, the classic expressions of anti-Semitism, the plot of the Jews to take over the world, blaming them for the death of Christ, Jews as the devil, the blood libel, and the poisoning of the wells. Those are still persisting. And for those who are unfamiliar with those expressions and how they fit in the historical context, I would suggest that you check out, I'm going to go back to our website here for a minute. Again, we're in the lesson plans here. Look at anti-Semitism, this unit, because that's where you explore the historical anti-Semitism. Again, for our purposes, we're talking about today. I'm going to go back to the handout. So we also have new forms of anti-Semitism based on these old ideas. So they're being repurposed, in other words, things like depictions of Jews as evil and subhuman, their quest for world domination and control over major institutions like media and economy and government. In addition, and this is what you've been hearing with the two testimonies, and certainly with what you've seen in the images from 2017, this denial and distortion of the Holocaust. Also, we have the opposition of the State of Israel's right to exist, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. And we'll explore that in just a moment. So we have heard a lot of this right now with the testimonies. Visual testimonies are really critical. I think too, data can help us understand the global, not local, but the global reach of anti-Semitism. And for that, I want to click on this image called the Global 100. Oh, where are you? Sorry. Let me try to find my Global 100 here. Why am I not finding it? My eyes aren't doing very well. You know, folks, I have, I'm old, and so I've got to wear progressives, and sometimes they don't work very well. I think this is what I want. This is the handout. I'll play for you for that. It's not seeming to open. Oh, there we go. Here we go. Okay, so this is the handout. But just for just a second, this is what I want, the Global 100 website. That's right, it's embedded in there. And thank you, Sam, for posting the link there as well. So let's take a look at this. I'm gonna give you a sense of what this is first, give you a pause to just look at it. Okay, so this is a really data-rich website, also by the ADL. They commissioned an independent research firm to research the attitudes and opinions about Jews in over 101 countries. Over 52,000 respondents participated in this. And in this survey, they had included 11 anti-Semitic statements that the respondents had to answer if it was probably true or probably false. And if the respondent answered 6 out of the 11 as probably true, then it was considered an individual harboring anti-Semitic attitudes. So with the magic of algorithms and such statistical analyses, they found that, again, I'm going to move my chat box here, that there is, in general, out of the 4.2 billion adults in these 101 countries, 26% of them, or 1.1 million, harbor anti-Semitic attitudes. Okay, so here's this big map that breaks it down based on the different regions. But before we do that, if I scroll down and click on See More, and it's going to come up here, you're going to see they have broken it down, gender, age, and religion. And this is again globally with the 101 countries. And here are, by the way, those statements. Okay. And just for our purposes, I'm just going to scroll to this particular question. Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust, 30%. If you click on that, you can see those demographics are broken down even more. Okay. Now, let's go back up to the map here, because as you can see, depending on the regions, those percentages changes. So for obvious purposes, let's go to the Americas. In general, with the various countries that are tagged here, 19% harbor anti-Semitic sentiments. Here in the United States, that's 9%. Let's take a look at that. If you click on that, it'll give you much more specific data. Okay, with the breakdown here. And then certainly, as you can see, we have those same 11 anti-Semitic statements. And with that particular question, they talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. We have about 22%. Okay. What's great about this map is that you can look at some other locations. Let's click on Western Europe, for example. Let's just pick Germany. You know, here they tried very, very hard to right the wrongs, if you will. And yet, despite that, you still see this persistence of these attitudes, 27%. Now, we have a tool that helps do some comparisons. So the last country I left off with Germany, which is why you see it here, and then they randomly pick another country, Côte d'Ivoire. And you see that there is this comparison that you can use to see where they land on those things, as well as some of the statements here. Okay, and you can see particularly with Germany, you've got 52%, they still talk too much about the Holocaust. So again, very powerful data source and intended to be interactive there. Another item that I want to highlight is this Did You Know? Infographics is certainly a great way to highlight some important data really quickly. We have those things for you. Let's click on the Holocaust Global Awareness and Denial. And as you can see, globally, 54% have heard about the Holocaust. That's not a lot if you really think about it. And then of those people who have heard about it, 32%, a third of them believe that it was a myth or greatly exaggerated. And then you can see that information broken up by regions. So you see there's these really great infographics that can help illustrate the story through number. Now, as you recall, I showed you a handout right here, Antisemitism Today, Interpreting Data. And so we ask our students to not just look at the data, but then begin to answer some of these questions where the answers can be found in this Did You Know section, which we just looked at. So it's a way for students to get familiar with that site, as well as begin to create this bigger picture of understanding how far of a reach anti-Semitism is all about. In the case that we looked at was Holocaust denial or distortion. Okay. So that is one tool that we use to help with understanding one form of contemporary anti-Semitism, which is the denial or the distortion of the Holocaust. We also have here, as you can see, the idea of the state of Israel's right to exist. That's another new expression of anti-Semitism. Now, I want to be clear here. We understand that broaching a conversation about Israel can be very difficult for teachers, especially if they are unfamiliar with the history and more specifically the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So we do have some information about that, give you a brief description of that. Right here, a brief history of Israel. But it's certainly not comprehensive or intended to give the entire complex history. Nonetheless, though, when we analyze this aspect of contemporary anti-Semitism, our purpose is not to try to compel students to accept or defend the policies of the Israeli government, but to become more aware of the anti-Semitic nature of some of the criticism and charges and efforts in the US and elsewhere that are leveled against Israel and its right to exist. Now, there is a handy tool to think about when is something, some statement, some criticism becomes more anti-Semitic than not. So we have that piece here. And we refer to them as the 3 Ds. Demonization, when Israel and its leader becomes demonized, when they're blown out of sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis, that's demonization. The second D is double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when it's singled out for human rights abuses, while other behaviors of known and major abusers such as China, Iran, Cuba, Syria, North Korea is ignored, that is considered anti-Semitism. And then the third D is delegitimization, when its fundamental right to exist is completely denied. So that is hopefully a helpful way to think about what is anti-Semitism versus valid, legitimate criticism. This is a way for our students to think about critical thinking as well as cultivating their media literacy skills. And let me get to that point with another handout called Anti-Semitic Words and Images Past and Present. We'll click on that. And here, this handout asks students to consider what makes this statement or image anti-Semitic, whether it's classical, a new form, riffed off an old idea, or a new expression. The first section is about the statements there, and we have the questions prompted. But let me scroll down to these images here. For some of you who have participated or have seen our materials, these 2 images are familiar to you. They're found in the second unit focused on anti-Semitism. But let's take a look at number 3 and number 4. Okay. So what I'd like for folks to do is take a look at number 3 here. Now it says a tattoo. I think it's actually, it looks like a tattoo simply because this paper looks like a skin color, a light skin color, but it is a poster, and this is the image here, demonstration in Seattle. What I'd like for you to do is think about, look at this image, and in the chat box, highlight some of the elements that you want your students to notice that speaks to the different forms of anti-Semitism, including anti-Semitism, or contemporary anti-Semitism, excuse me. What are those elements that you see? And furthermore, what is the message trying to convey? What is this image trying to convey? What do you see? Let's start with what do you see? Comparing Zionism to Nazism, thank you. What do you see? Mary says, I see a cycle with 2 sides to the issue. Thank you for that. Any other things that you notice or that you want your students to notice? Well, certainly the idea about, and Sammy and Mary brought this up, certainly the idea of this cycle, they're almost like one and the same. They feed off of each other. And again, that speaks to the contemporary anti-Semitism, comparing the Israel to Nazi Germany, and making them one and the same. Jews being poisonous, I see that Cecilia writes. So that is what it's communicating, that the efforts of Israel are so awful, they rise to the same level of Nazi Germany, making those two comparisons, those two connections. So, okay, so there we go. That's the one image. Let's move on to number 4 here. This is a cartoon from a Qatari newspaper. Let's start again with, what do you see? What are the markers that you see that speak to an anti-Semitic message, or that speaks to criticizing Jews? What I can do to this. So we have Monique writing, caricature of a Jew controlling the UN. Can you speak more specifically about what you see that sends that message? That idea of controlling, again, that's a new anti-Semitic canard based on old ideas, of this idea of controlling a major institution. What do you see that speaks to that? What do you want your students to notice? We see that, Monique, thank you for that. Monique, you've identified the fact that this is the steering wheel is the UN logo. That's right. We also know that person is Jewish because you have the Star of David. You see, the hat here and the long beard and the nose that speak to this, the markers of being Jewish for people. Very ugly caricature. You see the glasses, very shady, right? Shady practices, right? These are some of the older markers of anti-Semitism. You notice that the hand is on top of this shift gear that is Obama. So not only is it about the UN, but also controlling the United States in general. So this is really helpful to slow down the observation process, to really ask students to point out what are the specific markers, how does it evoke certain anti-Semitic notions, and so that helps students begin to cultivate their media skills, media literacy skills, using these kinds of images. So let me show you another document here to help illustrate more of how contemporary anti-Semitism shows up. This handout describes, has 3 different examples of real events that took place that represents the manifestation of contemporary anti-Semitism. We don't have a chance to go through it in great detail, but the first one, by the way, I'm sorry, this is man with an assault rifle in Denmark in 2015. People perhaps may recall that. For those who are more local in the Chicagoland area, the example 2 here is of a rally that took place in Chicago. And as you can see, the images here really starts veering away from legitimate criticism to the more anti-Semitic notions. And again, I want to re-emphasize the fact that, any country should be able to withstand and hear valid criticism. That is a democratic society, a democratic country. That is a given, and they do it a lot in Israel. There's a lot of debates about the policies there, and that's very important stuff to do, no doubt. But again, when it starts becoming, more vicious in these elements, then you have to begin to wonder, valid criticism or anti-Semitic criticism? The third example here is was a shooting also in the United States, in this case in Kansas City. So we ask students to take a look at these scenarios, these real events rather, and to begin to unpack them and understand how it is contemporary anti-Semitism, what's coming up in those situations there. So let me go back to the lesson plan here. And as I said before, the unit is divided up into various parts. Again, the first part is the what is contemporary anti-Semitism? The second part is examples of anti-Semitism today, which we just cited. And then the third one is about taking a stand. That's really important. I'm going to go back to my website here. Because I think we want to make sure that students know that this is not just going to be inevitable. This is just how life is. You can do something about it. One thing is that you have to do something. You cannot be a bystander here. Neutrality, here's a quote from Elie Wiesel. I can't move my hair. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. And I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind and try to communicate with our young people, with our students, and in a different way of talking about this. In the end, we'll not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends, by Martin Luther King Jr. So there is an important element to education, which is taking that knowledge and putting that into action. So what we have is this third section here about fighting, taking a stand against anti-Semitism. We have this great profiles of young activists that really help illustrate how there are young people out there that are trying to do right. These are great profiles for your students to look at, and to also just be mindful that it's not easy to be an activist. There is risk involved in that. So let's just be honest about those things and nonetheless instill hope and encouragement that they can make a difference. But the handout that I want to highlight is taking a stand scenarios for discussion here. These are, scenarios that perhaps you have seen in different iterations, things that are happening in social media, like scenario 1. I just want to focus on scenario 2, though. Students at your school decide to form a diversity club to promote mutual respect and offer a safe haven for all students who want to openly celebrate what makes them diverse. You join the club, which meets weekly. By the way, again, this is handouts for students. So this is from a student perspective, which meets weekly to share ideas, plan events, and discuss issues facing the school community. You notice that the group never discusses the concerns maybe affecting Jewish students. You mentioned this, that you've heard insensitive and hurtful jokes and comments about people who are Jewish, but the general response has been, that's not that big of a deal. Other groups have it worse. So the questions that follow tries to unpack some of these things here. But what I'm curious to hear from folks here is this question here, C. What message is sent to Jewish students specifically if the issue of anti-Semitism is not included in the topics to be addressed? What message is sent to students in general if this topic is not included? What do you hope your students will be able to think about or consider when answering this question? If we can just get a few folks in the chat box to answer that. What are some things that you hope your students will consider when answering this question? And as you're thinking about that or responding, some of the things that, certainly I hope that students will consider is this idea of inclusion, exclusion. Also recognizing that anti-Semitism is a real issue, and we certainly saw that with the examples. We certainly saw that in Charlottesville. And it is, it's really hard, even for me. I remembered when I was in a classroom working with a group of diverse students in a similar situation with, talking about diversity and inclusion. And there was a student who was Jewish. He said, I don't even want to be called a Jew because I feel like that's a bad word. I get embarrassed when somebody refers to me as a Jew. And that, that was really heartbreaking. Even the label being Jewish, being Jew, is problematic for Jewish students themselves. I mean, think about their identity development with that, their relationship with this aspect of who they are. So I think that was really helpful for me to be really mindful about that. That just is a shame of just even being called Jewish. Monique writes, want students to consider how not validating anti-Semitism equates to erasing it as a concern. It's not a real issue, right? It's almost like this denial in some respects, right? So we have to make sure that that is part of the conversation. In no way are we doing the oppression Olympics game, right? That's not what we want to play. Each issue has its own unique things and needs to be addressed in their own way, including anti-Semitism, no doubt. Thank you for that, Monique. What I want to do as a way to end, is to emphasize the fact that there are these big ways that we can respond. With that earlier document about profiles of activism, that speaks very largely. But we have to remember that even the smallest gestures are very important to break I'll let Timothy Snyder, who wrote this great little book called On Tyranny, writes, the moment you set an example, the spell of the status quo is broken and others will follow. So what does that mean? So of course, having demonstrations and rallies are important, but let's think about those small things. So perhaps people are familiar with this story. In the New York City subway system, there was these terrible anti-Semitic messages being scrawled on the wall of one of the subway trains. And it was staying there until a man got on board and he looked at it. And apparently he just said, does anybody have any hand sanitizers and a wipe? And the next thing you know, everybody's pulling their stuff out of their bags and he begins to erase the Sharpie message. What a relief. And it was so recognized as a small but important gesture. It made it to the New York Times. I mean, come on, this is really intense, folks. Think about another thing that was done. There was a swastika also written in a different part of the subway. And somebody, we don't know who, repurposed that swastika into this symbol called love. I thought that was really unique. Let's not forget, too, that, for a lot of people, the narrative is this tension between the Jewish-Muslim community. And yet we see here that when those Jewish cemeteries were being desecrated and there was huge vandalism that was going on, these two communities came together to try to create a united front. And what's even beautiful, by the way, and I'm going to click on this for a second, there was like a fun GoFundMe page, but it's called Launch Good. This was started by two Muslim activists. They said, we need to raise money to help repair the Jewish cemeteries. Look at that. Their goal was $20,000. Look at how much they actually got. They met that goal in 3 hours. In 3 hours. So let's also think about what the typical narrative is, and let's flip it on its head, right? Let's show also that there are people, there are communities that are coming together. They're really pushing against that narrative in important ways. I thought that was really a beautiful example there. And then we certainly know, and most recently, that there was an effort to have a second rally, Unite the Right rally. And here we have a huge, counter-protest, far exceeding the numbers of the maybe 20 or so that showed up at the Unite to Right rally. And here's an image of that, demonstrating that they are not going to tolerate this kind of belief of anti-Semitism. So here we have these small and also visible ways of combating anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism as well. So here's just a little bit about how you can start the conversation. I think most important here is that if there are these needs contact your local ADL office. Again, I'm here in Chicago. We have a Chicago office here. For those in Southern Illinois, the St. Louis office is down there. Contact them. We've got some great folks there who can help address these issues, or at least make a record of it to help us with our audit. So thank you for that. I know we've run out of time, but if you could please fill out that survey. As you can see, it's super short. That's just a screen image of that, and continue exploring our other professional development opportunities, which are all free, by the way. So with that, thank you again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Oops.